The mahogany table felt cold under my palms. Around us, the board members sat in heavy silence, their eyes darting between my brother's smug grin and my expressionless face. David leaned back, tapping his gold pen against the merger documents. He looked at the senior partners, then pointed a finger at me, his voice loud and echoing in the sterile room. "Make sure she gets a visitor's badge on her way out," he chuckled. Nobody defended me. My father, sitting at the head, simply looked at his watch. I didn't blink. I just watched the ink dry. Growing up, I was the shadow that kept the house running while David was the sun everyone orbited. My father started Miller and Associates with a single desk and a belief that blood was the only currency that mattered. By the time I turned 24, I wasn't just his daughter, I was the person who stayed until 9 p.m. fixing the spreadsheets David had mangled during his 2-hour liquid lunches. I remember a specific Tuesday 3 years ago. We were up for the Sterling account, a deal that would secure the firm's reputation for a decade. I had spent 6 months living on caffeine and adrenaline, drafting every clause and researching every loophole. It was my masterpiece. On the morning of the presentation, I walked into the conference room with my laptop, ready to finally take my seat at the table. My father was already there, standing by the window with his hands behind his back. David was sitting in my usual chair, feet up, scrolling through his phone. My father didn't turn around when he spoke. He told me that David would be leading the presentation today. He said it casually, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. I froze, the weight of the printed reports heavy in my arms. I asked why, my voice small and tight. My father finally turned, his eyes flat and practical. He said the Sterling Group was old school. They wanted to see a man in charge. They wanted to see the heir. He told me I could sit in the back and handle the technical questions if they came up, but I was not to speak unless spoken to. I looked at David. He didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He just smirked and told me to make sure the coffee carafe was full before the clients arrived. That afternoon, I watched from a folding chair in the corner as my brother stumbled through my data. He took credit for every insight. He laughed at the client's jokes while I sat in the shadows, a ghost in my own life. When the Sterling CEO praised the brilliant structure of the tax strategy, David beamed and said he'd had a vision for it months ago. My father clapped him on the shoulder, his face glowing with a pride he had never once directed at me. After the clients left, my father handed David the keys to the company car. I stood by the shredder, waiting for a "thank you" or a "good job" that I knew was never coming. Instead, my father looked at me and complained that the font on page 12 was a bit difficult to read. He told me to stay late and archive the files so David could start fresh on the next phase the following morning. It wasn't just about the work, it was the realization that my father didn't see a partner in me. He saw a high-end tool. I was the engine, and David was the shiny hood ornament. That night, as I sat in the dark office while the cleaning crew moved around me, I realized that fairness was a fairy tale. My father chose David not because he was better, but because it was easier for him to ignore my worth than to change his worldview. It was a quiet, cold betrayal that seeped into my bones. The pattern didn't just continue, it hardened into a law of nature within those office walls. Over the next 2 years, I became the silent architect of David's rising star. Every time he landed a new account, it was because I had spent my weekends mapping out the projections. Every time he was featured in a local business journal, the quotes he gave were words I had written for him in briefing memos he barely read. I remember my 30th birthday vividly. I didn't expect a party, but I thought my father might acknowledge the milestone. Instead, he called me into his office to tell me that David was being promoted to senior vice president. David was 32 and had spent the previous month mostly at his beach house, yet he was getting the title I had earned 3 times over. My father told me that this was for the image of the firm. He explained that clients liked the idea of a father-son legacy. When I pointed out that I had brought in 40% of our new revenue that year, he sighed, looking annoyed that I was bringing up numbers at a time like this. He told me that my salary was more than generous for someone in a support role. That was the word he used, support. He didn't see the 4 a.m. starts or the way I managed the entire back office staff who actually kept the lights on. To him, I was an expendable piece of the machinery, while David was the heir to the throne. The most cutting part was the casual nature of the exclusion. They would go to lunch at the club to discuss high-level strategy and leave me to handle the angry phone calls from vendors David had forgotten to pay. I would see them laughing in the hallway, two men who shared a secret language of unearned confidence, and I felt like a ghost haunting my own career. I started to notice that even the junior associates began to look past me. They saw how the wind blew. They realized that helping David was the only path to a bonus, while helping me was just extra work. I stopped trying to argue. I stopped asking for my name to be put on the pitch decks. I realized that as long as I kept the engine running, they would never let me out of the basement. They needed me too much to ever promote me. If I became an equal, who would do the work? My father's loyalty wasn't to the firm's success, it was to the comfort of his own ego, which was reflected in his son. I was the safety net that allowed them to be reckless. I was the one who made sure their mistakes didn't sink the ship, and for that, I was rewarded with deeper anonymity. I was being erased, one support task at a time, until I was nothing more than a voice on a speakerphone during the meetings that actually mattered. The breaking point arrived with a quiet tap on my office door. It was our family attorney, a man who had known me since I was a child. He looked pained as he handed me a folder. My father had decided to step down, but the transition plan wasn't what we had discussed. He wasn't just making David the CEO, he was restructuring my ownership stake. To protect the company's focus, my voting shares were being converted into a non-voting trust. In plain English, they were stripping me of my voice. They wanted my labor, but they wanted to ensure I could never challenge David's authority. I went to my father's office, the folder trembling in my hand. I didn't yell. I asked him if he remembered the year we almost went bankrupt, and how I had worked for free for 8 months to save the payroll. He didn't look up from his desk. He said that was family duty. He told me that David was getting married soon and needed the stability of a clear leadership title. He said that as a woman, I would eventually want to step back anyway, so this was actually a favor to me. He was giving away my legacy to fund David's social status. That was the moment the internal switch flipped. The hurt didn't vanish, it just went cold. I realized that I had been loyal to a ghost. My father wasn't a mentor, he was a gatekeeper. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply thanked him for the clarity and walked out. For the first time in my life, I stopped caring about the Miller and Associates name. I looked at the office, the desks I'd bought, the people I'd hired, and realized I didn't belong here. I was the one who had built this house, but I was being treated like a squatter. I spent that night at my kitchen table, not with a box of tissues, but with a laptop and a secure line to a private equity contact I'd spent years cultivating. I knew the firm's vulnerabilities better than anyone. I knew we were over-leveraged on the new downtown development. I knew the silent partners were nervous about David's reputation. If they wanted me to be a stranger, I would be the most dangerous stranger they ever met. I stopped asking for a seat at their table, I decided to buy the building instead. The withdrawal was surgical. I didn't quit, I simply became a ghost. I stopped correcting David's emails. I stopped double-checking the interest rates on our short-term loans. I watched as the firm's precision began to fray at the edges, replaced by my brother's chaotic overconfidence. Behind the scenes, I used my private holdings to quietly negotiate with the firm's primary creditors. To them, David was a liability they were looking to offload. To me, the firm was a set of assets I already knew how to manage. The acquisition took 6 weeks. It was clean, legal, and completely anonymous. On the morning of the signing, the atmosphere was thick with David's triumph. He thought he was signing a partnership merger that would inject millions into the company. He didn't realize he was signing a bill of sale. My father sat beside him, preening, as David went on his tirade about me being just the help. I let him finish. I let the silence stretch until the lead attorney cleared his throat and pushed the final document toward me, not David. The funds have cleared, the attorney said. I looked at David, whose smile was frozen in a mask of confusion. I told him the truth. I hadn't just saved the firm, I had purchased it through a holding company. I was no longer the sister who fixed his spreadsheets, I was the sole owner of the debt he had accumulated. I looked at my father. The pride in his eyes had turned to a hollow, frantic fear. He started to speak, to offer a family compromise, but I raised my hand. There were no more favors. David's hand was still hovering over his gold pen. I told him to put it away. I explained that under the new ownership, his position was redundant. The help had decided that the new boss didn't meet the company's standards. The room was deathly quiet as he realized he wasn't just losing a job, he was losing the legacy he had spent his life squandering. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked toward the door. I didn't look back to see them realize they were standing in a building that no longer belonged to them. I had spent years earning their respect. In the end, I decided that owning the company was much more practical. When I walked out of that conference room, the only thing behind me was silence. It was a silence that had been building for 22 years, a silence born of humiliation, neglect, and the realization that I was never going to be enough for a man who refused to see me. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I might see the look of terror in my father's eyes. But it wouldn't be the terror of a father losing his daughter, it would be the terror of a king losing his throne. We often think that revenge has to be a grand performance, screaming, crying, or dramatic confrontations. But the most devastating revenge is the cold, quiet indifference that comes when you finally stop asking for love from people who only see you as a tool. For over 2 decades, I was a beggar for my father's attention. I thought every straight A, every scholarship, and every midnight spent fixing David's messes would finally earn me a well done. But the truth was simpler and much crueler. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a legacy he could recognize in a mirror. He wanted a son to carry his name, even if that son was hollow inside. On that graduation day, when he cheered for the wrong name, the little girl inside me who wanted his pride finally died. In her place, a woman was born who realized that in this world, no one hands you a seat at the table, you have to buy the whole building. As I sit in my new office today, I realize that my victory isn't the money or the firm I took from them. My victory is the peace I feel when I wake up. I don't have to prove my worth anymore. I don't have to wait for that's my girl, that was never going to come. I have looked at my reflection and decided that I am enough. Many of you watching this might be feeling exactly how I used to feel. Maybe your family, your friends, or your boss treats you like just the help. But remember this, the engine is always hidden, but it's the only thing that makes the car move. If you are the engine, know your value. Become so capable, so strong, and so independent that one day, they won't even have the luxury of ignoring you. My father and brother lost everything today, not because I was cruel, but because they bit the hand that fed them for too long. That was their destiny, this is my choice. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been abandoned by those who should have protected you and found the strength to build your own life, tell me your story in the comments. Our paths are different, but our strength is the same. I'll see you next time with another story of hard truths and quiet power. Until then, take care of yourself and never, ever forget your worth. Subscribe for more real stories about quiet strength and hard truths.